close your eyes and drift back in time to an age where the sea whispered ancient secrets. Here, in the land of ice and fire, the Vikings dreamed of worlds beyond the horizon. Tonight, we sail with them into the quiet seas, toward the mystery of Vinland. Hello dear listeners, and welcome to tonight's bedtime story. As you settle into your comfortable bed, pull your blankets up close and let your eyes grow heavy. I invite you to journey with me back through time, back over 1,000 years ago, to an age of brave explorers, magnificent longships, and incredible discoveries that would change the world forever. Tonight, we'll follow the Vikings on their remarkable voyage across the vast Atlantic Ocean, to a land they would call Vinland, what we now know as North America. This is a story of courage, adventure, and the human spirit's endless desire to explore the unknown. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let your imagination carry you across the misty seas to a time when the world was young and full of mysteries waiting to be discovered. Our story begins in the year 970 in the rugged, windswept lands of Iceland. Picture, if you will, a place where fire and ice dance together in eternal harmony, where steaming geysers shoot toward the sky while glaciers gleam like diamonds in the pale northern sun. This was the home of Eric the Red, a Viking, with flame-colored hair and a spirit as wild as the northern storms. Eric was not like other men. While most Vikings were content to raid the coasts of England and France, Eric's eyes always turned westward, toward the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. He would stand on the black volcanic cliffs of Iceland, his red beard whipping in the salty wind, and wonder what lay beyond the horizon where the sea met the sky. In those days, Iceland was a new settlement, filled with Vikings who had fled the political turmoil of Norway. These hardy people had learned to live in a land of extremes where the summer sun barely set and the winter darkness seemed to last forever. They built their homes from stone and turf, raised sheep and cattle in the brief summers, and told stories around their fires during the long winter nights. But Eric the Red was a restless soul. He had been exiled from Norway for killing a man, in a dispute over land, and even in Iceland, his fiery temper led to more conflicts. When he was banished from Iceland for 3 years after another deadly quarrel, Eric saw this not as punishment, but as opportunity. He would use these 3 years to explore the unknown waters to the west. Eric had heard whispers from sailors who had been blown off course, tales of a land far to the west, a place where icebergs the size of mountains drifted in a sea so cold it could freeze a man's breath. Some called it a cursed land, a place where no man should venture. But Eric the Red was not a man to be deterred by superstition. In the spring of 982, as the ice began to break up around Iceland's shores, Eric gathered a crew of 25 brave men. These were not ordinary sailors, but Vikings, warriors and explorers who had sailed the treacherous North Sea and fought in battles across Europe. They trusted Eric's skill as a navigator and his reputation as a leader who could bring his men safely through any storm. Their ship was a magnificent longship, painted red and black, with a proud dragon head carved at its prow. The Vikings called such ships wave riders because they seemed to dance across the water rather than plow through it. These vessels were marvels of engineering, shallow drafted so they could navigate rivers, yet sturdy enough to handle the roughest seas. The ship's woolen sail bore the image of a raven, Odin's sacred bird, which the Vikings believed would guide them safely across the waters as Eric and his crew prepared to depart. The entire settlement gathered at the shore. Women blessed the ship with sacred herbs. Children threw flowers into the water for good luck. And the skald, the village storyteller, sang ancient songs of protection for those who dared to sail beyond the known world. Eric stood at the prow of his ship, his red cloak billowing behind him like a banner. He raised his hand to the crowd and spoke in a voice that carried across the water. We sail not for gold or glory, but for knowledge. We go to see what lies beyond the edge of our maps, to bring back tales that will be told around fires for generations to come. And with that, the dragon ship was pushed into the waves, its sail filled with the western wind, and Eric the Red began his journey into legend. The first days of the voyage were peaceful. The ship cut through the calm seas under cloudy skies, while Eric used his knowledge of the stars and the flight patterns of seabirds to navigate. The Vikings had no compass, but they possessed something perhaps more valuable, an intimate understanding of the sea and sky that had been passed down through generations of seafaring ancestors. But as they sailed further west, the weather began to change. The sky darkened to the color of slate, and the wind grew cold and fierce. Massive icebergs, white as fresh snow and larger than any building the Vikings had ever seen, began to appear on the horizon. These floating mountains of ice moved silently through the water like sleeping giants, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. But Eric the Red was a restless soul. He had been exiled from Norway for killing a man in a dispute over land, and even in Iceland, his fiery temper led to more conflicts. When he was banished from Iceland for 3 years after another deadly quarrel, Eric saw this not as punishment, but as opportunity. He would use these 3 years to explore the unknown waters to the west. For 3 days, Eric and his crew navigated through this frozen maze. The temperature dropped so low that their breath formed clouds in the air, and ice began to form on the ship's rigging. The men wrapped themselves in thick furs and huddled together for warmth, but Erik remained at the bow, his keen eyes searching for a break in the ice fields. On the fourth morning, as the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, one of Erik's men called out from the crow's nest, "Land ho!" Land to the west, through the morning mist. They could see the outline of towering cliffs and snow-covered mountains rising from the sea like the backbone of a sleeping dragon. Erik had discovered Greenland. As they drew closer to shore, the Vikings could see that this was indeed a formidable land. Massive glaciers flowed down from the interior like frozen rivers, and the coastline was jagged with fjords that cut deep into the heart of the country. But Erik's trained eye also noticed something else: patches of green grass growing in the valleys, and streams of fresh water flowing from the mountains. They landed in a sheltered fjord that Erik would later name Eriksfjord, and the moment their feet touched the rocky shore, Erik knew he had found something extraordinary. Yes, much of this land was covered in ice, but in the southern regions there were valleys where grass grew thick and green, where wildflowers bloomed in the brief summer, and where sheep and cattle could graze for 3 years. Erik and his men explored this new land. They built temporary shelters and learned to survive in this harsh but beautiful environment. They discovered that while the winters were long and brutal, the summers brought an explosion of life. Arctic foxes with fur white as snow roamed the tundra, seals basked on the ice floes, and the northern lights painted the winter sky in brilliant greens and purples. But perhaps most importantly, Erik realized that this land could support Viking settlements. The fjords were perfect harbors for longships, the valleys could provide grazing for livestock, and the seas teemed with fish and whales that could feed a growing population. When his exile ended, Erik returned to Iceland with tales that seemed too wonderful to be true. He spoke of a green land to the west, a place where a hardy Viking could build a new life far from the crowded settlements of Iceland. And with the cunning of a born leader, Erik gave his discovery a name that would entice others to follow him: Greenland. "Why do you call it Greenland when much of it is ice?" asked one skeptical farmer. Erik smiled, his red beard glinting in the firelight. "Because men will be more eager to go there if it has a good name. And besides," he added, looking out toward the western sea, "in the valleys where we will build our homes, it is indeed green." Word of Erik's discovery spread across Iceland like wildfire. In the longhouses where Viking families gathered during the dark winter months, people spoke in hushed, excited tones about this new land called Greenland. Some were skeptical. After all, how could there be good land even further west than Iceland? But others, particularly those who were struggling to make a living on Iceland's limited farmland, saw opportunity in Erik's tales. By the summer of 985, Erik had organized one of the largest Viking expeditions ever assembled: 25 ships, each carrying families with all their possessions, livestock, and supplies, prepared to make the dangerous journey to Greenland. This was not a raiding expedition or a quick voyage of exploration. This was a migration, the permanent move to establish a new Viking colony in the unknown west. The preparations took months. Each family had to decide what they could carry and what they must leave behind. Viking women packed their finest wool cloth, their cooking pots, their spindles and looms. The men brought their tools: axes, hammers, saws, and plows, everything needed to build new lives in a new land. Most precious of all were the animals: cattle, sheep, goats, horses, and pigs that would form the foundation of their new farms. Among those preparing for the journey was a young man named Leif Erikson, Erik the Red's eldest son. Leif was tall and strong like his father, but where Erik was impulsive and quick to anger, Leif was thoughtful and careful. Even as a young man, Leif showed the qualities that would make him a great leader: wisdom beyond his years, courage in the face of danger, and an insatiable curiosity about the world beyond the horizon. As the fleet prepared to depart, an air of excitement and nervousness filled the harbor. Children who had never seen anything but Iceland's black shores peered wide-eyed at the ships that would carry them to their new home. Elderly grandparents wondered if they would survive the journey to see this promised land. Young couples dreamed of the farms they would build and the children they would raise in Greenland's green valleys. The journey was treacherous. Of the 25 ships that set out from Iceland, only 14 completed the voyage. Some were turned back by terrible storms, others were crushed by icebergs, and a few simply vanished into the vast Atlantic, their fate unknown. But those who survived the crossing found that Erik had not exaggerated. Greenland's southern fjords were indeed capable of supporting Viking settlements. The survivors established 2 main settlements: the eastern settlement in what is now southern Greenland, where Erik built his own farm at Brattahlid, and the western settlement further up the coast. These weren't cities as we might imagine them, but collections of farms scattered throughout the fjords, connected by a network of sea routes and mountain paths. Life in Greenland was hard, but the Vikings were a hardy people accustomed to harsh conditions. They built their houses from stone and turf, with thick walls that could withstand the fierce Arctic winds. Inside these homes, families gathered around central hearths where peat fires burned day and night, providing warmth and light during the long polar nights. The Greenland Vikings developed a unique way of life, different from their cousins back in Iceland and Norway. They learned to hunt seals and walruses, whose meat provided food and whose oil lit their lamps during the dark months. They discovered that the land, while harsh, provided unexpected bounty: Arctic berries that grew wild in the summer, and medicinal herbs that helped them survive the extreme conditions. But perhaps most importantly, the Greenland Vikings maintained their tradition as explorers and traders. Each summer, when the ice cleared from the fjords, ships would arrive from Iceland and Norway, bringing news from the Old World and trading for Greenland's unique treasures: walrus ivory, polar bear furs, and narwhal tusks that were prized throughout medieval Europe. As the years passed, the Greenland settlements grew and prospered. Children who had been born during the crossing grew up to become skilled hunters and farmers. New ships arrived each year, bringing more settlers and supplies. Eric the Red became a respected leader, known for his fair dealing and his ability to organize the scattered settlements into a functioning community. But Leif Erikson, now a young man in his 20s, found himself looking even further west. Just as his father had once gazed from Iceland's shores toward the unknown, Leif would stand on Greenland's western cliffs and wonder what lay beyond the Davis Strait, where the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. The older Vikings told stories around their fires of lands even further west, tales brought by hunters who had been blown off course, or by Inuit peoples they encountered, who spoke of vast forests and rivers full of salmon far across the western sea. Most dismissed these as fantasies, but Leif listened carefully to every word. One evening, as the northern lights danced across the star-filled sky in ribbons of green and gold, Leif made a decision that would change history. He would gather a crew of brave men and sail west from Greenland, just as his father had sailed west from Iceland. He would discover what lay beyond the horizon, no matter how dangerous the journey might be. The winter of 999 was particularly harsh in Greenland. The fjords froze solid, and howling winds drove snow horizontally across the landscape for weeks at a time. During these long, dark months, the Vikings spent their time indoors, repairing tools, telling stories, and planning for the coming year. It was during this winter that Leif Erikson began seriously planning his westward expedition. Leif had grown into a remarkable young man, standing nearly 6.5 feet tall, with golden hair and piercing blue eyes. He commanded respect wherever he went. But it wasn't just his physical presence that made him a natural leader. Leif possessed an unusual combination of his father's adventurous spirit and a careful, analytical mind that served him well in planning complex voyages. That as the storms raged outside, Leif spent hours studying the stars through the brief clear periods, memorizing their positions and movements. He spoke with every hunter and trader who had ventured west of Greenland, carefully mapping in his mind the currents, wind patterns, and seasonal changes that would affect his journey. Most importantly, he listened to a trader named Bjarni, who had an extraordinary tale to tell. Bjarni had been sailing from Iceland to visit his father in Greenland when his ship was blown far off course by a fierce storm. For days he and his crew had sailed through fog so thick they couldn't see the length of their own ship. When the fog finally cleared, they found themselves looking at a coastline unlike anything they had ever seen. Not the familiar ice and rock of Greenland, but a land covered in dense forests that stretched as far as the eye could see. The trees were taller than any in Norway, Bjarni told Leif, his eyes distant with memory. They grew so thick that we couldn't see more than a few ship lengths into the forest, and the land was flat, not mountainous like Greenland or Iceland. We sailed along this coast for days, seeing forests that seemed to go on forever. Bjarni had been eager to reach Greenland and hadn't landed to explore this mysterious forested land. But his descriptions fired Leif's imagination. If there truly was a land of forests to the west, it would solve one of Greenland's greatest problems: the lack of timber. In Greenland, wood was so scarce that it was more valuable than silver. Ships and houses had to be built from driftwood, and the few stunted trees that grew in sheltered valleys. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Leif began gathering his crew. He didn't want a large expedition. He had learned from his father that smaller groups could move more quickly and quietly than large fleets. Instead, he carefully selected 35 men, each chosen for specific skills that would be needed. On a voyage of exploration, there was Turka, a German craftsman who had been with Eric's family since Leif was a child. Though not a Viking by birth, Turka was beloved by all who knew him. He was small and clever, with quick hands and an encyclopedic knowledge of plants, animals, and natural phenomena. Where the Vikings relied on strength and courage, Turka brought wisdom and careful observation. Leif also chose Thorvald, his younger brother, who was known as one of the finest archers in all of Greenland. Thorvald was quieter than Leif, more serious, but absolutely loyal and fearless in the face of danger. Then there was Thorstein, the youngest of Eric's sons, barely 18 but already proving himself as both a sailor and a diplomat. The crew was completed with men who possessed essential skills: Einar, who could navigate by the stars better than Any man in Greenland, Magnus a shipwright who could repair any damage to their vessel, Olaf who spoke several languages and could communicate with foreign peoples, and 30 others, each a master of his craft. Through the late spring and early summer of the year 1000, they prepared their ship with meticulous care. This was not just any vessel, but a specially designed exploration ship, slightly larger than a typical longship and built for extended voyages. The hull was reinforced to handle ice, and the ship carried extra supplies of food, fresh water, tools, and trade goods. On a clear morning in late June, when the midnight sun hung low on the northern horizon, Leif's expedition finally set sail. From Greenland, the entire settlement gathered to see them off, and Eric the Red himself, now growing old but still proud and strong, embraced his eldest son. "Sail safely, my boy," Eric said, his voice thick with emotion. "May Thor protect you, and Odin guide your path. And if you find this land of forests, remember to save some trees for your old father." Leif smiled and clasped his father's hand. "I'll bring you back a forest, father. Wait and see." With 35 brave souls aboard, their dragon ship turned its prow toward the setting sun and sailed into history. They called Leif the Lucky even before this voyage, for he seemed blessed by the gods with fair winds and good fortune. But the greatest test of his luck still lay ahead. Somewhere beyond the western horizon where the endless sea met the unknown. For the first 2 days, they sailed through familiar waters, past the outer islands of Greenland where Inuit hunters sometimes camped during the summer months. But on the third day, they entered waters no Viking had ever mapped. Here, massive icebergs drifted like floating islands, some so large that waterfalls cascaded from their summits, and polar bears could sometimes be seen riding them like ships. The crew marveled at these sights, but Leif kept his attention focused westward. According to Bjarni's descriptions, the forested land lay somewhere beyond these icefields, if only they could find it. Day after day, they sailed through increasingly unfamiliar waters, using every skill of seamanship they possessed to avoid the crushing ice and navigate the treacherous currents. On the 7th day of their voyage, young Thorstein called out from his position at the masthead, "Brother, land ahead. I can see mountains." Sure enough, rising from the western sea were snow-capped peaks and glaciers that glinted like crystal in the morning sun. But as they drew closer, Leif realized this was not the forested land Bjarni had described. This was a harsh, rocky coast covered in ice and snow with no sign of the great trees they sought. They landed briefly to explore, finding a landscape of flat stones and glaciers, but no vegetation beyond sparse moss and hardy grass. The land was starkly beautiful but offered nothing they couldn't find in Greenland. Leif named it Helgeland, the land of flat stones, and they sailed on, continuing their search for the mysterious forest land. After leaving Helgeland behind, Leif and his crew sailed south along the coast, hoping to find the variation in landscape that Bjarni had described. For 2 more days, they followed a coastline that seemed to consist entirely of rocky cliffs and barren tundra. The men began to wonder if they would find anything but ice and stone in this western land. But on the morning of the 10th day, everything changed as the sun rose over the eastern sea behind them, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The lookout called down with excitement in his voice, "The land is changing. I can see ... trees, great forests of trees." From the deck of their longship, the Vikings stared in amazement at a sight none of them had ever imagined. Stretching along the coast as far as they could see was a wall of green, not the scrubby bushes and stunted trees they knew from Iceland and Greenland, but a dense forest of towering trees that seemed to reach toward the very sky that as they sailed. Closer, the scent reached them first, the rich, sweet smell of growing things, of pine and fir and unknown flowering plants. For men who had spent their lives in lands where a tree taller than a man was a wonder, this forest seemed like something from the realm of the gods. "Look at the size of those trees," whispered Magnus the shipwright, his practical mind already calculating how many ships could be built from a single trunk. A man could hollow out one of those giants and have a boat larger than any longship ever built. Turka, the wise German, was studying the forest with different eyes. He pointed to breaks in the tree line where they could see open meadows. "There," he said quietly. "Those clearings mean this land has more than just trees. There must be streams, good soil, places where crops could grow." Leif ordered the ship to follow the coast southward, looking for a suitable place to land and explore. They sailed for hours along this forested shore, marveling at the sheer size and density of the woodland. Occasionally, they glimpsed animals moving among the trees, deer much larger than any they knew, and other creatures they couldn't identify. Finally, they found what they were looking for, a wide bay where a substantial river flowed into the sea, creating a natural harbor protected from the ocean swells. The river mouth was flanked by beaches of white sand, and beyond the beaches, the great forest stretched inland as far as they could see. They pulled their ship onto the beach and, for the first time, set foot in what would later be called North America. The moment their boots touched the sand, they knew they had discovered something extraordinary. The air was warm, much warmer than Greenland, even in summer. The forest floor was carpeted with soft moss and fallen leaves, and everywhere they looked they saw abundance. The trees were indeed giants, towering pines, firs and spruces that rose straight as shipmasts toward the sky. But there were other trees too, unfamiliar species with broad leaves and strange bark. Turker identified some as types of birch and maple, but others were completely unknown to the Vikings. They spent 3 days exploring this forested land, which Leif named Markland, the forest land. They cut down several trees to test the quality of the wood and found it superior to anything they had known. The timber was straight-grained and strong, perfect for shipbuilding and construction. A single tree from this forest could provide enough wood to build an entire house in Greenland. But Leif was not content to stop here. Bjorn's tale had mentioned sailing even further south, to lands that were even more welcoming. If Markland was this rich in resources, what wonders might lie ahead? On the 4th morning, they loaded their ship with sample logs and continued south. The coastline began to change again as they sailed. The dense pine forests gave way to mixed woodlands, and they began to see more open spaces, natural meadows and clearings that suggested a gentler, more hospitable climate. The weather, too, was becoming more pleasant. The cold bite of the northern air was replaced by gentle breezes that carried the sense of unknown flowers and flowering trees. The crew, accustomed to the harsh conditions of Greenland and Iceland, could hardly believe they were still in the same world. Young Thorstein, standing at the bow of the ship, called back to his older brother Leif. This feels like the stories the skalds tell of Asgard, the realm of the gods. How can such a place exist in the world of men? Leif smiled, but his eyes remained fixed on the horizon ahead. Perhaps the gods have saved their greatest secret for last. Brother, let's see what else they have to show us. As they continued south, the landscape became even more varied and beautiful. They saw coastal plains covered in wildflowers, rivers that flowed crystal clear from forest-covered hills, and beaches that sparkled with an almost magical quality in the summer sun. Whales played in the offshore waters, and flocks of seabirds circled overhead in numbers beyond counting. On their 5th day of sailing south from Markland, they rounded a headland and saw something that made every man aboard catch his breath. Ahead of them lay a bay so beautiful it seemed like something from a dream, a perfect crescent of white sand beach, sheltered by wooded hills and fed by a river that sparkled like silver in the afternoon sun. But what truly amazed them was the quality of the light itself. Here, so much further south than they had ever traveled, the sun seemed warmer and brighter than they had ever experienced. The very air seemed to shimmer with golden warmth, and for the first time in their lives, these hardy northerners felt truly warm. We'll land here, Leif decided. This place calls to me. If we're going to build a camp and truly explore this new land, this is where we'll do it. They sailed into the bay as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. As their ship's keel touched the soft sand of the beach, Leif stepped into the shallow water and waded ashore. He knelt and picked up a handful of the fine sand, letting it run through his fingers as he looked around at this paradise they had discovered. We'll call this place Leif's Beer, he announced, Leif's Shelters, but in his heart he suspected this land deserved a far grander name. Little did he know that he had just become the first European to set foot on the continent that would one day be called America. The first morning in their new camp dawned clear and warm, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of the forest and the sound of birdsong unlike anything the Vikings had ever heard. As Leif and his men woke in their temporary shelters on the beach, they found themselves in a world transformed by the golden light of this southern sun. The Vikings had always been early risers in Greenland and Iceland. The brief summer days were too precious to waste sleeping. But here, they discovered something wonderful. The days were long and warm, longer than even the best summer days back home. The sun rose early and set late, giving them many hours of comfortable working time. Leif organized his men into exploration parties, wanted to learn everything he could about this new land, its plants, animals, climate, and potential for settlement. Some men would explore inland along the river, others would map the coastline, and still others would test the soil and study the local flora. The group that followed the river inland made the first remarkable discovery. The river was not just beautiful, it was teeming with salmon. These were not the small, tough salmon of northern waters, but massive fish, some as long as a man's arm and so numerous that the water seemed to boil with their movement during their spawning runs. By Thor's hammer, breathed Einar, the navigator, standing knee-deep in the river as salmon swirled around his legs. A man could feed his family for a year with a single day's fishing in this stream, but the real prize lay deeper in the forest. As Turker and a small group pushed inland, following animal paths through the dense woodland, they discovered that this land was rich beyond their wildest dreams. There were nut trees bearing loads of food, berry bushes heavy with fruit, and clearings where wild grapes grew in such abundance that the vines seemed to cover entire hillsides. It was Turker who made the discovery that would give this land its most famous name. The clever German had wandered further from the group than he should have, following his curiosity through a particularly dense grove of trees. When he failed to return to camp that evening, Leif became worried and organized search parties to find his old friend. They found Turker the next morning, sitting beneath a massive grapevine, his face stained purple and wearing the biggest smile any of them had ever seen. He was practically dancing with excitement as he led them back to what he had discovered. "Leif, my boy," Turka exclaimed in his accented Norse, gesturing wildly at the grove around them. "Look at this place. Look what grows here." He pointed to vines heavy with clusters of dark grapes, some so full they bent the branches nearly to the ground. The Vikings stared in amazement. None of them had ever seen grapes growing wild in such profusion. In the warm countries of Europe, grapes were carefully cultivated by monks and farmers, and wine was a luxury that only the wealthy could afford. But here, nature had created its own vineyard, vast and untended. "Turka," Leif said slowly, "do you mean to tell me these are the same grapes they used to make wine in the southern lands?" The German nodded enthusiastically. "The very same, but better, sweeter, larger. In all my travels through the Germanic lands I have never seen grapes like these. This land could produce wine to rival anything made in Francia or the Italian kingdoms." The discovery changed everything. The Vikings had found not just a land of forests and salmon, but a place that could produce one of the most valuable commodities in the medieval world. Wine was not just a drink, it was a symbol of wealth, sophistication, and divine blessing. A land that could produce wine was a land fit for kings. Leif made a decision that would echo through history. They would spend the winter in this remarkable place, learning everything they could about its secrets. They would build proper shelters, explore thoroughly, and gather samples of everything valuable they found. And when spring came, they would return to Greenland with proof of their discovery, including wine made from these miraculous grapes. The Vikings set to work with characteristic efficiency. Using their axes and the abundant timber, they built a substantial camp near the mouth of the river. Their main hall was constructed in the traditional Viking style, but using woods they had never worked with before. Rich aromatic cedar that resisted rot and insects, and hardwoods so dense they could barely drive nails into them. Around the main hall, they built smaller structures for storage, workshops, and sleeping quarters. They constructed a dock extending into the river where their ship could be safely moored, and they built fish traps to harvest the incredible salmon runs. As summer turned to autumn, the land revealed even more of its secrets. The forest was home to game animals in astonishing variety and number. There were deer much larger than any in Scandinavia, with magnificent antlers that could span the width of a man's outstretched arms. There were bears, but not the white polar bears of Greenland. These were massive brown and black bears that fed on the salmon and berries. Most surprising of all were the huge humped creatures that Leif's men found in clearings deep in the forest. These beasts were larger than the largest cattle, with massive heads and shaggy brown coats. The Vikings had never seen anything like them and didn't know what to call them. They were seeing their first American bison, though they wouldn't learn that name for many centuries. But perhaps the most wonderful discovery was the climate itself. Even as winter approached, the weather remained mild compared to what they knew from Greenland. Snow fell, but it was light and didn't stay long. The river never froze completely, and even in the coldest months, they could venture outside without the heavy furs that were essential for survival in their homeland. Turker spent his time perfecting the art of winemaking. With the wild grapes, using techniques he had learned in Germany, combined with careful experimentation, he produced wine that exceeded even his own expectations. The Vikings, more accustomed to beer and mead, found this wine remarkably smooth and flavorful. "This is better than anything I've tasted in the courts of German princes," Turka declared, raising a wooden cup filled with the deep red liquid. "This land truly is blessed by the gods." And so, as the long gentle winter passed, Leif gave this land its most enduring name, Vinland, the land of wine. It was a name that would capture the imagination of Europeans for centuries to come, symbolizing a paradise across the Western Sea, where nature provided abundance beyond imagining. As spring returned to Vinland in the year 1001, Leif and his men prepared for their return journey to Greenland. They had gathered an impressive collection of proof for their discovery: samples of the various woods, containers of wine, preserved grapes, furs from unknown animals, and detailed descriptions of everything they had seen. But 3 days before their planned departure, something happened that would add an entirely new dimension to their story. Olaf, who had been checking the fish traps downriver from their camp, came running back with urgent news. "Leif," he called, still breathing hard from his sprint through the forest. "There are boats on the river, small boats with men in them, but they're not like any men I've ever seen." Leif immediately gathered his weapons and his most trusted men. Moving quietly through the forest along the riverbank, they crept toward the location Olaf had described. What they saw there filled them with wonder and caution in equal measure. Paddling up the river in vessels unlike any Viking ship were men who looked completely different from any people the Norse had ever encountered. Their skin was copper-colored, their hair black as a raven's wing, and they wore clothing made from animal skins decorated with intricate beadwork and feathers. Their boats were marvels of engineering, lightweight canoes made from birch bark that moved through the water with impossible grace and silence. These were the indigenous peoples of the land. though the Vikings didn't yet understand that they had encountered a civilization far older than their own. The Norse called them Skrallings, which meant simply foreigners or barbarians in their language. But they would soon learn that these people were anything but barbaric. The two groups observed each other across the water for several tense minutes. The indigenous hunters, for that's what they were, following the salmon run up the river, had noticed signs of the Viking camp and had come to investigate these strange pale-skinned visitors to their ancestral lands. Leif made a decision that showed his wisdom as a leader. Rather than hiding or preparing for battle, he stepped into view on the riverbank and raised his hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. He was unarmed except for a small knife at his belt, and he moved slowly and deliberately, to show he meant no harm. One of the indigenous men, clearly their leader, responded by raising his own hand and speaking words in a language unlike anything the Vikings had ever heard. It was musical and flowing, very different from the harsh consonants of Norse speech. What followed was one of history's first recorded peaceful encounters between Europeans and Native Americans, using gestures, drawings in the sand, and the few trade items Leif had brought. The two groups began a cautious but friendly communication. The indigenous people were as curious about the Vikings as the Norse were about them. They marveled at the Vikings' metal tools and weapons, for they worked primarily with stone, bone, and wood. In return, they showed the Vikings wonders of their own incredibly detailed knowledge of the forest and its resources, hunting techniques, perfected over thousands of years, and craftwork of stunning beauty and practicality. Turka, with his gift for languages and his naturally friendly manner, became the unofficial ambassador between the two groups. Within a few hours he had learned several dozen words in the local language and was able to establish basic communication. The indigenous people called their river Kichigami, meaning great water, and they had been following the salmon runs along this coast for countless generations. The leader of the indigenous group was a man of perhaps 40 years, with intelligent eyes and hands that spoke as eloquently as his voice. Through gestures and simple words he conveyed to Leif that his people knew of the Vikings' camp and had been watching them for several days. But rather than seeing the Vikings as invaders, he seemed genuinely curious about these strange visitors from across the great water. "Why do you watch us from hiding?" Leif asked, through Turka's translation. The indigenous leader smiled and spoke at length, gesturing toward the forest and the sea. Turka listened carefully and then translated. "He says his people wanted to understand what manner of beings we are. He says we build like the beaver but sail like the whale, and they wished to know if we were men or spirits." This peaceful first contact continued for 3 days. The Vikings learned more about Vinland in those 3 days than they had in all their months of exploration. The indigenous people showed them which plants were good to eat, which ones could be used for medicine, and how to read the signs of weather and season in this new climate. Most importantly, they learned that this land was not empty or uninhabited. It was home to many different peoples, each with their own territories, customs, and ways of life. Some were primarily hunters and fishers. Others practiced agriculture, growing crops that the Vikings had never seen: corn with kernels like golden jewels, beans that climbed tall poles, and squash that grew to enormous sizes. On the final day of contact, the indigenous leader made a gesture that deeply moved Leif. He presented the Viking chief with a beautifully crafted bow made from one of the great trees of Markland, its wood polished smooth as silk, and decorated with intricate carvings. In return, Leif gave him a small iron knife, one of the most valuable items he possessed. As the indigenous hunters prepared to continue upstream, following the salmon to their spawning grounds, their leader spoke one final time to Turka. The German listened intently, then turned to Leif with a troubled expression. "What did he say?" Leif asked. Turka was quiet for a moment before answering. "He says we are welcome to visit their land, but we should remember that it belongs to many peoples, and not all of them may be as friendly as his own. He says the great water connects all lands, but it also separates different worlds, and we should be careful which world we choose to call home." The wisdom of those words would prove prophetic in the years to come. For now, as Leif watched the graceful canoes disappear around a bend in the river, he felt a deep respect for these people who had shown such courtesy to strangers from an unknown land. That evening, as the Vikings sat around their fire for the last time in Vinland, Leif made a decision that would shape all future expeditions to this new world. "When we return," he told his men, "we come as guests, not conquerors. This land has its own people, its own ways. We can learn much from them, and perhaps they from us, but only if we approach with respect." The voyage back to Greenland was blessed with fair winds and calm seas, as if the gods themselves approved of Leif's discoveries. The heavily laden ship made good time across the Western Ocean, and the crew's spirits were high as they anticipated, sharing their incredible stories with the folks back home. On their 3rd day at sea, they encountered something that would add one final element to Leif's legendary luck. Through the morning mist, they spotted another ship, clearly a Viking vessel, but sailing erratically and showing signs of distress. As they drew closer, they could see that the ship's sail was torn and men were bailing water frantically from the hull. Without hesitation, Leif ordered his ship to approach and offer aid. This was the code of the sea that all Vikings lived by, no matter what quarrels might exist on land. Sailors helped sailors when lives were at stake on the vast ocean. That the distressed vessel turned out to be a merchant ship that had been caught in a severe storm while traveling from Iceland to Greenland. Their cargo of valuable goods was intact, but they had sprung several leaks and were in danger of sinking before they could reach land. Leif's crew worked quickly to transfer the 15 survivors to their own ship, along with the most valuable portions of the merchant's cargo. Though this meant their ship was now crowded and heavy, Leif never hesitated. In saving these men, he had not only done the right thing but had also increased his own crew for the remainder of the journey. Among the rescued merchants was a man named Thoria, who carried with him several chests of silver coins and amber jewelry intended for trade in Greenland. In gratitude for his rescue, Thoria insisted that Leif accept half of his valuable cargo as payment for saving their lives. "You have saved not just our lives but our livelihoods," Thoria said formally. "Accept this gift, and know that the story of your generosity will be told in every trading port from here to Constantinople." This rescue added significantly to the wealth that Leif was bringing back from his voyage, but more importantly, it provided additional witnesses to his discoveries. The rescued merchants had seen the massive logs from Markland loaded in Leif's ship, had tasted the wine from Vinland, and had heard the detailed accounts of the new lands. When they reached Greenland, their testimony would support Leif's claims and add credibility to what might otherwise have seemed like fantastic tales. When the familiar mountains of Greenland finally appeared on the eastern horizon, the entire crew cheered with joy. They had been gone for over a year, and many of their families had given them up for lost. As their dragon-proud ship sailed into Eriksfjord, people came running from farms scattered throughout the valley to welcome them home. Eric the Red himself stood on the dock, his red hair now streaked with gray but his bearing still proud and strong, when he saw his eldest son standing tall at the ship's prow, alive and well. The old chieftain's eyes filled with tears of relief and joy. "Welcome home, my son," Eric called across the water as the ship approached. "I have missed your voice in my hall and your wisdom in my counsels." But when Leif and his men began unloading their cargo, the entire settlement fell silent with amazement. The logs from Markland were larger and finer than any wood they had ever seen. The wine from Vinland was unlike anything they had tasted. The furs and artifacts from the new lands spoke of wealth and abundance beyond imagination. That evening, in Eric's great hall, Leif told the complete story of his voyage to an audience that included every important person in the settlement. The hall was packed with farmers, hunters, craftsmen, and their families, all eager to hear about the lands beyond the Western Sea. Leif was a gifted storyteller, as all Viking leaders needed to be. He spoke of the harsh beauty of Helgeland, incredible forests of Markland, and the paradise they had found in Vinland. He described the salmon runs that darkened the rivers, the grapevines that provided wine fit for kings, and the gentle climate that made outdoor work possible even in winter. But he also spoke honestly about the indigenous peoples they had encountered. "These Skrallings are not savages," he told the assembled crowd. "They know secrets of this land that it would take us lifetimes to learn. They have lived there since time began, and they have rights to the land that we must respect." When he finished his tale, the hall erupted in excited discussion. Some men immediately began planning their own expeditions to these rich new lands. Others worried about the dangers of sailing so far from home, but all agreed on one thing: Leif Erikson had achieved something remarkable, and his name would be remembered forever. Eric the Red listened to all the discussions with a thoughtful expression. Finally he stood and the hall fell silent. The old chieftain's voice was strong as he addressed his son and the assembled crowd. "My son has discovered lands that will provide for our people for generations to come," Eric declared. "But let us be wise in how we proceed. These new lands are rich, but they are also far from our home and inhabited by peoples we do not yet understand. We should establish trade and friendship first, and only then consider larger settlements." It was wise advice, born from a lifetime of experience in establishing colonies in harsh lands. But Eric was growing old, and he knew that the future belonged to the younger generation. As he looked at Leif, now proven as both explorer and leader, he felt a deep pride and satisfaction. His son had surpassed even his own achievements that winter. As the northern lights danced over Greenland's frozen fjords, the story of Vinland spread from settlement to settlement. Around every fire, people spoke of the magical land across the Western Sea where wine flowed like water and trees grew tall as mountains. The discovery captured the imagination of every Viking who heard it, and many began planning their own journeys to explore this new world. The success of Leif's expedition had fired the imaginations of Vikings throughout Greenland, but none was more affected than Thorvald, Leif's younger brother. Where Leif was content to have made his great discovery and established his fame, burned with desire to return to Vinland and explore it more thoroughly. Thorvald was different from his older brother in many ways. Where Leif was diplomatic and careful, Thorvald was more direct and action-oriented. He was an excellent warrior and an even better hunter, known throughout Greenland for his skill with bow and spear. But he also possessed a restless spirit that couldn't be satisfied with farming and trading in the known world. Through the winter following Leif's return, Thorvald studied every detail of his brother's maps and listened to every story the crew told about Vinland. He questioned Turker extensively about the climate, the seasons, the best places to land, and the safest routes through the coastal waters. By spring, he had developed a comprehensive plan for a return expedition. Brother Thorvald said to Leif, one evening as they sat in their father's hall, "You have opened the door to a new world, but you only stepped one foot through it. Let me take a proper expedition to Vinland, not just to visit for a season, but to establish a real settlement, to map the coastlines, to learn everything there is to know about this land." Leif considered his brother's proposal carefully. He had no desire to return immediately to Vinland himself. He was content with his discovery, and was busy managing his new status as a hero and leader in Greenland. But he recognized the wisdom in Thorvald's plan. "You have my blessing," Leif finally said. "Take my ship and my maps. But remember what I learned about the Skrallings. They are not enemies unless we make them so. Be careful, brother. This new land is beautiful, but it may also be dangerous." In the summer of 1002, Thorvald set sail for Vinland with a crew of 30 men, including several veterans from Leif's original expedition. Their ship was loaded not just with supplies for exploration, but with materials for building a permanent settlement, iron tools, seeds for planting, livestock, and everything needed to establish a self-sufficient colony. The voyage to Vinland was remarkably smooth, aided by Leif's detailed navigation notes and the experience of the returning crew members. They reached Leif's original camp without serious incident and found the buildings still in good condition after their abandonment the previous year. Thorvald spent his first month in Vinland repairing and expanding the settlement. He added new buildings, improved the harbor facilities, and established a more organized system for exploring the surrounding territory. His plan was to spend 3 full years in Vinland, enough time to map the coastline thoroughly and establish permanent Norse presence in the new world. The first year of exploration exceeded even Thorvald's ambitious expectations. They discovered that Vinland was even larger and more varied than Leif had realized. Sailing north and south along the coast, they found bays and rivers that could support multiple settlements, forests that seemed to stretch inland forever, and natural harbors that could accommodate entire fleets of Viking ships. They also made contact with several different groups of indigenous peoples, each with their own customs and ways of life. Some were nomadic hunters who followed herds of game animals through the forests. Others lived in permanent villages where they practiced sophisticated agriculture, growing crops in carefully tended fields and storing surplus food in underground chambers that could feed their communities through the winter. Thorvald was particularly impressed by the indigenous people's knowledge of navigation and geography. They had detailed mental maps of the entire coast, knew the best routes between distant regions, and could predict weather patterns with remarkable accuracy. Through trade and careful diplomacy, Thorvald was able to learn much of this knowledge, which he carefully recorded in his own maps and journals. The indigenous peoples, for their part, were fascinated by the Vikings' metal tools and weapons. Iron was unknown in this part of the world, and the superiority of metal axes and knives over stone tools was immediately apparent. A thriving trade developed, with the Vikings exchanging iron goods for furs, food, and local knowledge. But as Thorvald pushed his explorations further from the main settlement, he began to encounter groups that were less welcoming to the Norse presence. Some indigenous peoples saw these pale strangers as a potential threat to their territory and way of life, and they were not interested in peaceful coexistence. It was during the second summer of his stay that Thorvald made the discovery that would define his legacy. While exploring a particularly beautiful fjord far north of Leif's Spear, his party encountered a group of indigenous warriors who were clearly not interested in trade or diplomacy. The meeting began peacefully enough. Thorvald's men had beached their ship to make repairs to a damaged sail when they noticed smoke rising from the forest inland. Following Viking custom, Thorvald decided to investigate. It was considered proper courtesy to announce one's presence to the local inhabitants. Rather than camping secretly in their territory, they found a village of bar-covered houses set in a clearing beside a clear stream. The villagers initially seemed friendly, offering food and expressing curiosity about the Vikings' metal tools and woolen clothing. But as the day progressed, tensions began to rise. The problem, as Turk would later explain, was a misunderstanding about the Vikings' intentions. The villagers assumed that Thorvald's men were the advanced scouts for a large invasion force, and they began making preparations to defend their homes. The Vikings, seeing the villagers gathering weapons and sending messengers to other villages, assumed they were planning an attack. What happened next was tragic, but perhaps inevitable given the cultural gulf between the two peoples. A young Viking, nervous about the growing tension, misinterpreted a gesture from one of the villagers as an attack and struck out with his sword. The villager was wounded, and in an instant, the peaceful meeting erupted into violence. The fight was brief but deadly. The Vikings' superior weapons and armor gave them an advantage, but they were vastly outnumbered. In the confusion of battle, Thorvald was struck by an arrow that found a gap in his mail shirt. The wound was deep and serious, and despite his men's efforts to help him, Thorvald knew he was dying. His men carried him back to their ship and sailed quickly back to Leif's Spear. But Thorvald's strength was failing. As they sailed south along the coast he had explored so thoroughly, Thorvald gathered his men around him and spoke his final words. "This land is more beautiful and rich than anything our people have ever known," he said, his voice growing weak. "But it belongs to others, and they have the right to defend it. We came seeking adventure and found it, but we also found a lesson. The new world is vast enough for all peoples, but only if we approach it with wisdom and respect." Thorvald asked to be buried on a beautiful headland overlooking the sea, with a cross marking his grave. His men built a simple but dignified tomb from stones they gathered on the beach, and they held a funeral ceremony that combined Viking traditions with prayers to the Christian god that many Greenlanders had begun to worship. Thorvald's death cast a shadow over the expedition, but his men continued his work of exploration and mapping. They spent one more winter in Vinland, carefully documenting everything they had learned and preparing detailed reports for the leaders. Back in Greenland, when they finally returned to Greenland in the summer of 1005, they brought with them not just treasure and trade goods, but a sobering lesson about the complexities of establishing settlements in an already inhabited land. Thorvald's death had shown that while Vinland was indeed a land of incredible opportunity, it was also a place where different worlds would meet, sometimes in friendship and sometimes in conflict. The news of Thorvald's death in Vinland struck the Greenland settlements like a thunderbolt. Eric the Red, already weakened by age and illness, was devastated by the loss of his second son. But it was Thorstein, the youngest of Eric's sons, who felt the tragedy most keenly. Thorstein had always looked up to his older brothers, and the thought of Thorvald lying in an unmarked grave in the distant new world was more than he could bear. Thorstein was different from both Leif and Thor. Where Leif was the diplomat and Thorvald the warrior, Thorstein was the dreamer and the poet. He had inherited his father's red hair and his mother's gentle nature, and he was known throughout Greenland for his skill as a skilled storyteller, who could weave tales that would make strong men weep and children sit spellbound for hours. But now Thorstein's storytelling talents were overshadowed by a burning desire to honor his brother's memory. Through the winter of 1005, he planned an expedition with a single purpose: to sail to Vinland, find Thorvald's grave, and bring his brother's remains back to Greenland for proper burial in the family plot beside their ancestors. It was a dangerous mission. Sailing to Vinland was risky enough without the added burden of locating a specific site in the vast wilderness, but Thorstein was determined, and his cause attracted supporters. Many young Vikings who had heard the tales of Vinland saw this as their chance to see the legendary land for themselves. Thorstein's wife, Gudrid, was a remarkable woman who would play a crucial role in the Viking exploration of America. She was intelligent, brave, and deeply devoted to her husband. When Thorstein announced his intention to sail to Vinland, Gudrid insisted on accompanying him. "You go to honor your brother," she told him firmly, "but you also go into danger in an unknown land. You will need someone to tend wounds, to cook meals, to provide the wisdom of a woman when the counsel of men is not enough. I go with you." This was unusual. Viking exploration expeditions typically included only men, but Gudrid was no ordinary woman. She had been born in Iceland to a prosperous farming family and had received an education that was remarkable for the time. She could read and write, knew several languages, and possessed a deep knowledge of medicine and healing that would prove invaluable in the wilderness. In the spring of 1006, Thorstein and Gudrid set sail for Vinland with a crew of 25 men. Their ship was smaller than those used by previous expeditions but was specially equipped for the recovery mission. They carried ropes and pulleys for moving heavy stones, proper burial materials, and supplies for an extended search of the Vinland coast. The voyage began well, with favorable winds and clear skies carrying them swiftly across the familiar route to Vinland. But as they approached the waters where Vinland should have appeared, something went wrong. A thick fog bank rolled in from the north, so dense that they couldn't see beyond the length of their ship for 3 days. They sailed blindly through this fog, trying to maintain their course by dead reckoning and the sound of waves on distant shores. When the fog finally lifted, they found themselves looking at a coastline. But it was not the familiar shores of Vinland. This land was different, colder and more barren than the lush forests and meadows Leif had described. The trees were smaller and more sparse, and the landscape had a wild, untamed quality that spoke of a harsher climate. They had been blown off course, probably to a region north of Vinland, though exactly where, they couldn't be sure. Thorstein made the difficult decision to continue the search rather than turning back immediately. They spent weeks sailing along this unknown coast, looking for landmarks that would indicate they had found the right area. But as summer turned to autumn, it became clear that they were lost in the vast wilderness of the North American coast. The weather began to deteriorate as winter approached. Storms became more frequent and more severe, and ice began forming in the sheltered bays. Finally, Thorstein had to accept that they would not reach Vinland before winter set in. They would have to find a place to overwinter in this unknown land. They found shelter in a deep fjord, protected from the worst of the winter storms. working quickly before the worst weather arrived. They built a camp similar to those established by previous expeditions, a main hall surrounded by smaller buildings for storage and workshops. But this winter would test their survival skills to the limit. The winter of 1006 to 1007 was one of the harshest in memory. Storm after storm battered their camp, and temperatures dropped so low that even these hardy Vikings struggled to stay warm. Food became scarce as the severe weather made hunting and fishing nearly impossible. Worst of all, disease struck the expedition. It began with just a few men complaining of fever and weakness, but within weeks, nearly half the crew was seriously ill with what appeared to be a combination of scurvy, pneumonia, and other ailments brought on by the harsh conditions and poor nutrition. Gudrid worked tirelessly as a healer, using every remedy she knew, but the sickness continued to spread. In midwinter, when the nights seemed endless and the cold was so intense that their breath froze in the air, Thorstein himself fell ill. Despite Gudrid's devoted care, his condition worsened steadily. As he lay in their small shelter, burning with fever and struggling to breathe, Thorstein spoke to his wife about his regrets. "I have failed my brother," he whispered. "I came to bring him home, but instead I have led good men to their deaths in this cursed place." Gudrid took his hand in hers, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "You have not failed anyone, my beloved. You came here for love of your brother and love of adventure. That is never failure, no matter what the outcome." Thorstein died 3 days before the winter solstice, on the longest night of the year. Gudrid held him in her arms as his spirit departed, and she sang the ancient songs that Vikings believed would guide the souls of the dead to Valhalla, the Hall of Heroes. The surviving members of the expedition buried Thorstein in a grave overlooking the sea, marking it with stones, arranged in the shape of a ship, the traditional Viking symbol for a journey to the afterlife. Gudrid spoke words over the grave that those who survived would remember for the rest of their lives. "Here lies Thorstein Erikson, son of Eric the Red, brother of Leif the Lucky. He sailed far from home seeking to honor the dead and found honor. In death may his spirit sail the endless seas until all waters lead him home." When spring finally came to their winter camp, only 18 of the original expedition remained alive. The survivors were weak from their ordeal but determined to honor both Thorstein and their lost companions by returning safely to Greenland, under Gudrid's leadership, for she had emerged as the expedition's guiding force. During the dark winter, they prepared their ship and began the long journey home. The voyage back to Greenland was difficult but successful. Gudrid proved herself to be not only a capable leader but also a skilled navigator, using the knowledge she had gained from years of listening to sailors' tales. When they finally sailed into Eric's Ford, they carried with them a story of tragedy but also of courage and survival against impossible odds. Eric the Red received the news of Thorstein's death with the stoic dignity expected of a Viking chieftain, where those close to him could see how deeply it affected him. He had now lost 2 sons to the western lands, and though he remained proud of their achievements, the cost seemed almost too great to bear. Gudrid, now a widow at the age of 25, became one of the most respected women in Greenland. Her survival of the terrible winter, her leadership of the expedition's return, and her detailed knowledge of the western lands made her a valuable advisor to anyone planning future voyages to Vinland. But Gudrid's role in the Vinland story was far from over. Her experiences had made her one of the few people alive who truly understood both the opportunities and the dangers of establishing settlements in the New World. This knowledge would prove crucial in the next chapter of the Viking exploration of America. 3 years after Thorstein's tragic death, a merchant ship arrived in Greenland carrying a passenger who would play a pivotal role in the continuing saga of Vinland. His name was Thorfinn Karlsefni, and he was everything that a Viking hero should be: tall, strong, intelligent, and wealthy enough to finance major expeditions. Thorfinn was an Icelander by birth, but he had spent years traveling the known world as a merchant and explorer. He had traded in the markets of Dublin and York, had sailed the rivers of Russia to reach the great city of Constantinople, and had accumulated both wealth and wisdom from his travels. But when he heard the stories of Vinland, he became obsessed with the idea of establishing permanent Viking settlements in the New World. What made Thorfinn different from previous explorers was his comprehensive approach to colonization. Where Leif had made a discovery expedition and Thorvald had attempted a settlement with limited resources, Thorfinn planned a full-scale colonization effort that would establish a self-sufficient Viking community in Vinland during his winter stay in Greenland. Thorfinn married Gudrid, Thorstein's widow. This was not just a marriage of convenience, though it certainly strengthened Thorfinn's position among the Greenland Vikings. Gudrid and Thorfinn developed a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared dreams of establishing a new Norse world across the Western Sea. Gudrid brought more than just her personal knowledge of Vinland to the marriage. As Thorstein's widow, she had inherited his claim to lands in Vinland, and her survival of the difficult winter expedition had earned her the respect of every Viking who heard her story. Her support for Thorfinn's plan gave it credibility and helped him recruit the large crew he would need. Through the winter of 1008 to 1009, Thorfinn organized the most ambitious Viking expedition ever attempted. His plan was to establish not just a temporary camp, but a permanent colony that could grow and prosper independently of the Greenland settlements. This required a much larger group of colonists, not just warriors and sailors, but farmers, craftsmen, women and children who could create a complete community. By spring, Thorfinn had assembled an expedition of unprecedented size, 3 ships carrying 160 people, including 65 men, 90 women, and 5 children. This wasn't just an exploration party, it was the foundation of a new Viking nation in the New World. The expedition included people with every skill necessary for establishing a civilization: blacksmiths to work iron, carpenters to build houses, weavers to make cloth, farmers to raise crops, and healers to care for the sick and injured. They brought livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, and horses that would provide the foundation for agriculture in their new homeland. Most remarkably, they also brought women and children, something no previous expedition had attempted. Viking women were not just wives and mothers, but active participants in their society's economic and cultural life. They managed farms, engaged in trade, and possessed skills in textile production, food preservation, and medicine that would be essential for a successful colony. The voyage to Vinland in 1009 was like a floating village crossing the Atlantic. The 3 ships stayed close together for safety, but they also maintained constant communication. Children who had never seen anything but Greenland's icy fjords stared in wonder at the endless expanse of ocean around them. Women who had left comfortable homes behind sang traditional songs to keep their spirits up during the long days at sea. Thorfinn and Gudrid sailed on the lead ship, which also carried the expedition's most valuable supplies and its most experienced sailors. Gudrid had become an expert on Vinland geography during her previous voyage, and her advice proved invaluable in navigating the complex coastal waters. When they finally reached Vinland and sailed into the familiar bay where Leif spears stood, the colonists were amazed by the beauty and abundance they found. The camp established by Leif and expanded by Thorvald was still in good condition, but it was far too small for a group of 160 people. Thorfinn immediately began planning a much larger settlement. They chose a site a few miles inland from the original camp, beside a large lake that was fed by the Salmon River. This location offered several advantages: fresh water, protection from ocean storms, fertile soil for farming, and access to both the forest resources and the sea. They named their new settlement Streamfjord and began the enormous task of building a permanent Viking town in the New World. The construction of Streamfjord was a marvel of Viking engineering and organization. Within the first month, they had built a great hall that could accommodate the entire community for meetings and celebrations. Around this central building they constructed individual family houses, workshops for various crafts, storage buildings for food and supplies, and a fortified fence that could protect the settlement in case of attack. But Thorfinn's vision extended far beyond simple survival. He wanted to create a true Viking town that could serve as the capital of a Norse kingdom. In America, they built a blacksmith's forge where iron tools could be manufactured and repaired. They established workshops for woodworking, leather crafting, and textile production. They even built a small church where the Christian members of the community could worship. The first harvest season in Streamfjord exceeded everyone's hopes. The rich soil of Vinland proved perfect for the crops the Vikings had brought from home. Their wheat and barley grew taller and fuller than anything they had ever seen in Greenland. The livestock thrived in the mild climate and abundant grazing, and within months they had more food than they knew what to do with. But perhaps the most exciting development was the birth of the first European child in the New World. In the early winter of 1009, Gudrid gave birth to a son, whom she and Thorfinn named Little Snorri. Thorfinnsson was a healthy, strong baby who would forever hold the distinction of being the first person of European descent born in America. The birth of Snorri seemed to bless the entire settlement. The colonists saw it as a sign that their new home was truly meant to be a place where Vikings could build a lasting civilization. Children born in Vinland would grow up as true Americans, equally at home in the great forests and on the wide ocean. As their first winter in Streamfjord progressed, the settlers established contact with several groups of indigenous peoples. Following the lessons learned from Thorvald's tragic encounter, Thorfinn insisted on a policy of careful diplomacy and fair trade. These early contacts were generally positive, with both sides benefiting from the exchange of goods and knowledge. The indigenous peoples were fascinated by the Vikings' domestic animals, having never seen cattle, horses, or sheep before. In return, they showed the Vikings advanced techniques for preserving food, making warm clothing from animal hides, and navigating the complex river systems that crisscrossed the continent. Trade flourished between the Vikings and various indigenous groups. The Norse offered iron tools, woolen cloth, and small metal ornaments in exchange for furs, food, and guides who could help them explore the interior regions. Both sides seemed to benefit from these exchanges, and for a time, it appeared that peaceful coexistence was possible. However, as the settlement grew and more Vikings arrived from Greenland, tensions began to develop. Some of the indigenous peoples became concerned about the permanent nature of the Viking settlement. Unlike previous expeditions that came and went with the seasons, Stromfjord was clearly intended as a permanent colony that would expand over time. Cultural misunderstandings also created problems. The Vikings' practice of allowing their cattle to graze freely sometimes led to conflicts when the animals wandered into areas that indigenous groups considered sacred or important for their own food gathering. The Norse concept of land ownership was fundamentally different from indigenous ideas about territorial use, leading to disagreements that neither side fully understood. Most seriously, some of the younger Vikings, especially those who had not been present during the peaceful early contacts, began to view the indigenous peoples as obstacles to be overcome rather than neighbors to be respected. These men argued that Vikings had always taken what they needed by force when necessary, and that this new land should be no different. Thorfinn found himself caught between his desire to establish a successful colony and his commitment to maintaining peaceful relations with the native peoples. He worked tirelessly to mediate disputes and maintain the delicate balance between the two communities. For 2 years, this balance held. The settlement of Stromfjord grew and prospered, becoming a true Viking town in the American wilderness. Children played in meadows filled with wildflowers, farmers tended crops that grew with miraculous abundance, and craftsmen worked with materials they had never dreamed of using. Young Snorri grew from a baby to a toddler who could walk and run through the forests of his birth. He was equally comfortable playing with Viking children and with the indigenous children who sometimes visited the settlement with their parents. In many ways, Snorri represented the hope that these two very different cultures could find a way to coexist in the vast American continent. But in the 3rd year of the settlement, the fragile peace finally broke down. The exact cause was never clearly recorded, but it seems to have involved a dispute over trade that escalated into violence. Unlike Thorvald's encounter, which had been a tragic misunderstanding between small groups, this conflict involved larger numbers on both sides, and had been building for months. The fighting was sporadic but serious, with attacks and counterattacks that made normal life impossible. The Vikings found themselves under siege in their own settlement, unable to hunt, farm, or gather the resources they needed to survive. Worse, they were vastly outnumbered by indigenous warriors who knew the land intimately and could strike without warning before disappearing back into the forest after several months of intermittent warfare. Thorfinn called a meeting of all the adult colonists to decide their future. The choice was stark. They could continue trying to maintain their settlement through constant warfare, or they could abandon Vinland and return to the safety of Greenland. "We came here to build a new life," Thorfinn told the assembled colonists. "But we cannot build anything lasting on a foundation of conflict. This land is rich and beautiful, but it belongs to others who were here long before us. We can trade with them and visit them, but we cannot simply take their home and make it ours." Gudrid supported her husband's wisdom, though the decision to leave broke her heart. Vinland had become her home, and little Snorri had taken his first steps on American soil, but she could see that continued conflict would destroy everything they had. Work to build. In the summer of 1012, the great Viking colony of Stromfjord was abandoned. The settlers loaded their ships with all the valuable materials they could, carry timber from Markland, furs from their trading, and samples of the miraculous grapes that made Vinland's wine. But they left behind their houses, their farms, and their dreams of a permanent Viking kingdom in America. The return of Thorfinn's colonists to Greenland marked the end of the major Viking attempts to establish permanent settlements in North America, but it was not the end of the Vinland story. For generations to come, smaller expeditions would continue to visit the lands across the Western Sea, maintaining trade relationships and gathering the valuable resources that made the dangerous journey worthwhile. Back in Greenland, Thorfinn and Gudrid established themselves as leading members of the community. Their wealth from the Vinland expeditions allowed them to build one of the finest farms in the colony, and their knowledge of the western lands made them valuable advisors to anyone planning trading voyages or exploration expeditions. Young Snorri grew up as something of a celebrity in Greenland, the boy who had been born in the mythical land of Vinland. As he matured, he showed signs of inheriting his parents' adventurous spirit and his grandfather Eric's natural leadership abilities. But Snorri's destiny lay not in returning to his birthplace, but in exploring other frontiers. The stories of Vinland became part of Viking oral tradition, passed down from generation to generation around winter fires. The scouts, the professional storytellers who preserved Viking history and culture, crafted elaborate poems and sagas that celebrated the discoveries of Eric the Red, Leif the Lucky, and all the brave souls who had sailed into the unknown Western Sea. These sagas were more than just entertainment. They served as historical records, navigation guides, and inspiration for future generations of explorers. Children who grew up hearing tales of Vinland's abundance and beauty often became the merchants and adventurers who would continue the connection between Greenland and the American continent. Through the early decades of the 11th century, regular trading expeditions sailed from Greenland to Vinland. These were smaller groups than the early exploration expeditions, usually consisting of a single ship with 20 to 30 men, traveling specifically to gather timber, furs, and other valuable trade goods. The indigenous peoples of the Vinland coast came to expect these annual visits. Some groups established regular trading relationships with the Vikings, meeting them at predetermined locations along the coast to exchange goods. These interactions were generally peaceful and beneficial to both sides, following the diplomatic precedents established by Leif and carefully maintained by subsequent expedition leaders. The most valuable export from Vinland was not wine or furs, but timber. The massive trees of Markland and Vinland provided wood that was not just superior in quality to anything available in Greenland, but was essential for maintaining the colony's ships and buildings. Without regular imports of American timber, the Greenland settlements would have faced serious difficulties in maintaining their infrastructure on return. The Vikings brought iron tools, woolen cloth, and knowledge of metalworking that was highly valued by the indigenous peoples. They also brought news and stories from across the Atlantic, connecting the Native American communities with developments in the wider world in ways that would have been impossible otherwise. But perhaps the most important thing the Vikings brought back from Vinland was knowledge. Each expedition returned with new information about American geography, climate, plants, animals, and peoples. This knowledge was carefully preserved and became part of the collective Viking understanding of the world. Maps drawn by Viking explorers that showed the American coast with remarkable accuracy. Considering the limited technology available to them, they correctly identified the major geographical features, the position of the great forests, the locations of important rivers, and the general outline of the coast from Labrador to New England. The Viking knowledge of America was so detailed and accurate that it was preserved in written sagas centuries later when literacy became more common in Iceland and Norway. The most famous of these was the Saga of Eric the Red and the Saga of the Greenlanders, which provided detailed accounts of the various expeditions to Vinland. These sagas were not just stories, but practical guides that could be used by future explorers. They contained navigation instructions, descriptions of safe harbors, information about local peoples and customs, and warnings about potential dangers. For anyone planning a voyage to the western lands, these sagas were invaluable resources. As the 11th century progressed, Greenland colony itself began to face challenges that would eventually limit further exploration of America. Climate change, a gradual cooling that historians call the Little Ice Age, made both farming and sailing more difficult in the high Arctic. The sea routes between Greenland and Iceland became more treacherous as ice persisted longer into the summer months. Political changes in Europe also affected the Viking world. The rise of powerful kingdoms in Norway, Denmark, and England reduced the independence of Viking communities and made large-scale exploration expeditions more difficult to organize and finance. But the greatest challenge facing the Greenland Vikings was their isolation from the rest of the European world. As overland trade routes developed and maritime technology improved, Iceland and Norway began to trade directly with European markets, bypassing Greenland entirely. The colony that had once been a vital link in Viking trade networks gradually they became an isolated outpost struggling to maintain connections with the outside world. Despite these challenges, expeditions to Vinland continued sporadically for more than 2 centuries after Leif's original discovery. The last recorded Viking voyage to America took place in 1347, when a ship returning from Markland with a cargo of timber was blown off course and landed in Iceland with tales of the western lands that seemed as fantastic as ever. By this time, however, the world was changing in ways that would soon make Viking exploration of America seem like ancient history. In southern Europe, new technologies and ideas were emerging that would enable much larger and better equipped expeditions to cross the Atlantic. The age of Viking exploration was ending, but their discoveries would not be forgotten. As we near the end of our story, dear listeners, let us take a moment to reflect on what the Vikings accomplished in their brief time in the New World. For nearly 500 years before Columbus set sail from Spain, Norse explorers had been crossing the Atlantic Ocean and establishing contact with the American continent. The Viking achievement was remarkable not just for its chronological precedence, but for its character. These were not conquistadors seeking gold and glory, but explorers and settlers looking for new homes and opportunities. They approached the indigenous peoples of America with a spirit of trade and diplomacy that, while not always successful, showed a respect for native rights that would sadly become rare in later European colonization efforts. The Vikings' impact on American history was subtle but significant. Their trade relationships introduced metal tools to indigenous communities centuries before other European contact. Their detailed geographical knowledge, preserved in the sagas, provided information about American geography that would later prove valuable to other explorers. Most importantly, the Viking expeditions demonstrated that the Atlantic Ocean was not an insurmountable barrier. At a time when most Europeans believed the world ended somewhere west of Ireland, Norse sailors were proving that skilled seamanship and courage could carry humans to undreamed of new worlds. The descendants of the Vinland explorers carried their stories back to Iceland and Norway, where they became part of the cultural heritage that would inspire later generations of explorers. When Christopher Columbus was planning his voyage to find a western route to Asia, he almost certainly knew the Viking stories of lands across the Western Ocean. But the Vikings' greatest legacy in America was not their settlements or their trade. goods. It was their demonstration that different peoples could meet across vast distances and find ways to coexist. The peaceful contacts between Vikings and indigenous Americans showed that cultural exchange was possible even between peoples as different as Norse seafarers and Native American forest dwellers. Snorri Thorfinnsson, the first European born in America, grew up to become a respected leader in Iceland. He never returned to his birthplace, but he carried within him the knowledge that the world was far larger and more diverse than most people imagined. His descendants would include some of Iceland's greatest explorers and scholars. Gudrid, the remarkable woman who had participated in more Vinland expeditions than any other person, lived to be an old woman honored throughout the Norse world. In her later years, she made a pilgrimage to Rome, becoming one of the few people of her time to have traveled from the New World to the heart of the Old World. The Pope himself is said to have granted her an audience, eager to hear her stories of the lands beyond the Western Ocean. The Greenland colony that had served as the launching point for Viking exploration of America continued for several more centuries, but gradually declined as climate change and political isolation took their toll. The last recorded communication between Greenland and the outside world occurred in 1408, nearly 4 centuries after Leif's first voyage to Vinland, when European explorers returned to the North American coast in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. They found few traces of the Viking presence. The wooden buildings of Straumfjord had long since rotted away or been reclaimed by the forest. The indigenous peoples had oral traditions that spoke of pale-skinned visitors from across the sea, but these were dismissed by most European colonists as myths and fantasies. It would not be until the 20th century that archaeological evidence would finally confirm what the sagas had been saying all along. In 1960, Norwegian archaeologists Helge and Anne Stein Ingsted discovered the remains of a Viking settlement at Lons O'Meadows Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. The careful excavation of this site provided physical proof that Vikings had indeed established settlements in North America more than 500 years before Columbus. The Lons O'Meadows Meadows site revealed the foundations of 8 buildings, including a great hall, workshops, and storage areas that matched exactly the descriptions in the medieval sagas. Artifacts found at the site, iron nails, a bronze pin, and a spindle whorl for making thread, confirmed that this was indeed a Viking settlement and that it had included both men and women. But perhaps most remarkably, the archaeological evidence confirmed the accuracy of the saga accounts. The geographical descriptions, the details of Viking building techniques, and even the accounts of interactions with indigenous peoples all proved to be historically reliable. The medieval storytellers had preserved an accurate record of one of humanity's greatest adventures. As our bedtime story draws toward its close, let us consider the deeper meanings contained within the Viking sagas of Vinland. These were not just adventure stories told to entertain long winter nights, but profound meditations on the human desire to explore, to discover, and to find new homes in an uncertain world. The saga of Eric the Red teaches us about the courage required to venture into the unknown. Eric could have remained safely in Iceland, accepting his exile as punishment and living quietly until it ended. Instead, he chose to see his banishment as an opportunity to discover something new. His willingness to sail into uncharted waters, to explore a land of ice and glaciers, and to imagine settlements where others saw only wilderness, represents the best of human adventurous spirit. Leif the Lucky's story shows us the importance of careful preparation and wise leadership in any great endeavor. Leif didn't simply sail west hoping for the best. He studied every piece of available information, chose his crew with care, and approached his expedition with both courage and prudence. His peaceful contact with the indigenous peoples of Vinland demonstrated that even the most different cultures can find ways to communicate and cooperate. The tragic tale of Thorvald reminds us that even the best intentions can lead to conflict when different peoples meet without sufficient understanding. Thorvald's death was not the result of evil or aggression, but of misunderstanding and fear on both sides. His story teaches us the importance of patience, cultural sensitivity, and the recognition that good intentions alone are not enough to prevent tragedy. Thorstein's failed expedition illustrates the role that fate and circumstances play in human endeavors. Despite careful planning and noble purposes, Thorstein's quest to honor his brother's memory ended in disaster. Yet even this failure contributed to the larger story by demonstrating the dangers involved in Viking exploration and by preparing Gudrid for her later, more successful ventures. Thorfinn and Gudrid's great colonization attempt shows us both the possibilities and the limitations of cross-cultural settlement. For a time, their colony at Straumfjord represented a successful merger of Viking determination with American abundance. The birth of Snorri symbolized the potential for a new kind of civilization that combined the best of both worlds. But the ultimate failure of the permanent settlement also teaches important lessons about the complexities of colonization. The Vikings learned that discovering a new land is one thing, but building a lasting civilization requires much more than courage and good intentions. It requires understanding, cooperation, and respect for the rights and cultures of existing inhabitants. Perhaps most importantly, the Vinland sagas teach us about the power of exploration to expand human consciousness. Each Viking who sailed, to America returned with a broader understanding of the world and humanity's place in it. They had seen that the earth was larger and more diverse than anyone had imagined, and that human beings had created successful civilizations in environments and climates very different from their own. The indigenous peoples who met the Vikings also gained new perspectives on their world. The arrival of these strange visitors from across the Great Water proved that their continent was connected to other lands and other peoples in ways they had never imagined. The iron tools and new technologies brought by the Vikings spread throughout indigenous trade networks, reaching communities that never directly encountered the Norse explorers. In the centuries that followed the end of regular Viking voyages to Vinland, the story took on an almost mythical quality in Norse culture. The sagas were retold and embellished, and Vinland came to represent not just a geographical location, but an ideal, a perfect land where brave souls could find peace, prosperity, and adventure. During the long winter nights in Iceland and Norway, grandparents would tell their grandchildren about Leif the Lucky and his magical discovery of the land where grapes grew wild and trees reached to the sky. These stories served multiple purposes. They entertained, they educated, and they preserved the memory of one of humanity's greatest adventures. But the Vinland stories also served a deeper psychological function. They represented the eternal human dream of finding a better place, a land where life would be easier and more fulfilling than in the harsh realities of daily existence. For people struggling to survive in the difficult conditions of medieval Scandinavia, Vinland offered hope that somewhere beyond the horizon lay a paradise waiting to be discovered. This dream was not unique to the Vikings. Every human culture has stories of distant lands where life is better, where the sun always shines, where food is abundant, and where people live in harmony. The Vikings' discovery of America gave concrete form to this universal dream, proving that such places could actually exist and be reached by those brave enough to seek them. The indigenous peoples of America had their own stories about the pale visitors from across the Great Water. These tales, passed down through oral tradition for hundreds of years, spoke of strange men who came in floating houses, who had skin like snow and hair like fire, and who brought wonderful gifts of metal that cut better than stone. Some indigenous stories portrayed the Vikings as spirits or supernatural beings who had emerged from the sea to test human beings with gifts of great power. Others saw them as ordinary men from a distant land who had simply lost their way and needed help finding their path home. But all of these stories, whether Viking or indigenous, contained a common thread: the recognition that the world was far larger and more mysterious than any single people could fully understand. The brief encounter between Vikings and Native Americans had opened a window between two different worlds, allowing each to glimpse the vastness of human possibility. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance, the Viking stories of Vinland began to influence European thinking about geography and exploration. Scholars studied the sagas, trying to determine exactly where these legendary lands might be located. Cartographers included Vinland on their maps of the North Atlantic, usually placing it somewhere west of Greenland in the vast unknown of the Western Ocean. When Christopher Columbus proposed his voyage to find a western route to Asia, he was certainly aware of the Viking stories. While Columbus's goal was different from the Vikings, he sought to reach the Spice Islands of the East Indies rather than to explore unknown lands. The precedent set by Norse exploration may have influenced European willingness to finance his expedition. The rediscovery of America by Columbus and subsequent European explorers initially overshadowed the Viking achievement. The Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French expeditions that followed Columbus were larger, better documented, and had more immediate and dramatic consequences for both European and American history. But the Viking legacy persisted in the stories and traditions of the northern European countries. In Iceland and Norway, the sagas continued to be told, and many families claimed descent from the heroes of Vinland. The names Eric the Red, Leif the Lucky, and Gudrid, the far traveler, became legendary figures comparable to the heroes of ancient mythology during the age of European colonization of America. Some explorers specifically looked for traces of the Viking presence. French explorers in Canada collected indigenous stories about pale visitors from long ago. English colonists in New England found place names that seemed to have Norse origins, though most of these connections proved to be coincidental. It was not until the modern archaeological discovery at Lonzo Meadows that the full truth of the Viking achievement was finally recognized. The careful scientific excavation of the site provided undeniable proof that the sagas had been accurate historical records, not just entertaining fantasies. This discovery changed how historians viewed both Viking culture and the European discovery of America. The Vikings were now recognized as the true first Europeans to reach the New World, and their achievement was seen as even more remarkable, given the limited technology and resources available to them. But perhaps more importantly, the archaeological confirmation of the Vinland voyages reminded the modern world of an important truth: that exploration and discovery are fundamental human drives that transcend any particular culture or historical period. The Vikings' achievement was not just about reaching America first, but about demonstrating the eternal human willingness to sail beyond the horizon in search of something better. As we prepare to conclude our journey through the sagas of Vinland, let us pause to consider what these ancient stories can teach us in our modern world. The Vikings who discovered America faced challenges that are remarkably similar to those what we face today: how to explore responsibly, how to interact respectfully with different cultures, and how to balance the desire for adventure and discovery with the need for wisdom and restraint. The environmental lessons of the Vinland Sagas are particularly relevant today. The Vikings found a land of incredible natural abundance, forests that seemed infinite, rivers teeming with fish, and wildlife in numbers beyond counting. But they also learned that this abundance was not unlimited and that it supported complex ecosystems and human communities that had existed for thousands of years. The Viking approach to resource use in Vinland was generally sustainable. They took what they needed for survival and trade, but they did not attempt to clear-cut entire forests or permanently alter the landscape. Their relatively small expeditions had minimal environmental impact compared to later European colonization. Efforts taught the social lessons of Vinland are equally important. The Vikings discovered that successful exploration requires not just physical courage but cultural intelligence. The expeditions that succeeded were those that approached indigenous peoples with respect and sought to establish mutually beneficial relationships. The expeditions that failed were those that relied on force or assumed cultural superiority. Leif's peaceful first contact with the Skrallings demonstrated that meaningful communication is possible even across significant cultural and linguistic barriers. Through patience, goodwill, and careful attention to non-verbal communication, he was able to establish friendly relationships that benefited both sides. Thorfinn's colonization attempt showed both the possibilities and the limitations of attempting to establish permanent settlements in lands already inhabited by other peoples. For a time, the Viking colony at Stremfura represented a successful model of coexistence, with trade and cultural exchange benefiting everyone involved. But the ultimate failure of the permanent settlement also demonstrated that good intentions and mutual benefit are not always enough to overcome deeper conflicts over land use and territorial control. The Vikings learned that being the first Europeans in America did not give them the right to claim the continent as their own. The personal stories within the larger saga also offer timeless lessons about courage, family, and the pursuit of dreams. Eric the Red's transformation from an exiled troublemaker to a visionary leader shows how adversity can become opportunity for those willing to embrace it. His willingness to risk everything on an uncertain venture across unknown seas demonstrates the kind of bold thinking that drives human progress. Gudrid's story is perhaps the most inspiring of all. As a woman in a male-dominated society, she could have easily remained safely at home while the men went off on their adventures. Instead, she chose to participate fully in the exploration of the New World, bringing her own skills and perspectives to the endeavor, and ultimately becoming one of its most important leaders. Her survival of the terrible winter that killed her first husband, her successful leadership of the survivors' return to Greenland, and her crucial role in the largest colonization attempt all demonstrate qualities that transcend gender stereotypes: intelligence, courage, adaptability, and the ability to inspire others in difficult circumstances. The story of Little Snorri, the first European born in America, reminds us that exploration and discovery are not just about the immediate adventurers but about the future generations who will inherit the worlds that explorers create. Snorri's birth in Vinland symbolized the potential for new kinds of human communities that could combine the best elements of different cultures. Though the Viking settlement of Vinland ultimately failed, Snorri's existence proved that such combinations were possible. He grew up truly bicultural, equally at home with Viking traditions and American realities, representing a bridge between worlds that would not be built again for many centuries. The technological lessons of Vinland are also worth considering. The Vikings achieved their remarkable feat of Atlantic exploration, using tools and techniques that seem primitive by modern standards. They had no compasses, no accurate maps, no weather prediction systems, and no communication methods that could connect them with home base once they sailed beyond the horizon. Yet they successfully navigated thousands of miles of open ocean, established settlements in completely unknown territories, and maintained trade relationships across vast distances. Their success was based on careful observation of natural phenomena, detailed knowledge passed down through generations of seafarers, and the kind of practical intelligence that comes from living closely connected to the natural world. The Viking achievement reminds us that human exploration and discovery depend less on technological sophistication than on courage, determination, and the willingness to learn from both success and failure. The most advanced equipment in the world cannot substitute for the kind of mental toughness and adaptability that allowed the Vikings to thrive in environments as diverse as the ice fields of Greenland and the forests of Vinland. As the centuries passed and the direct Viking connection to America faded into legend, the story of Vinland took on new meanings and served different purposes for different peoples. But the essential truth at its heart, that brave souls can sail beyond the known world and discover wonders beyond imagination, remained as powerful as ever. During the Renaissance, when European scholars rediscovered classical learning and began to take a new interest in geography and exploration, the Vinland Sagas were studied with fresh eyes. Humanist scholars in Iceland carefully copied and preserved the ancient texts, recognizing their value as historical documents as well as literary treasures. These scholars understood that the sagas represented more than just Viking adventure stories. They were among the earliest European accounts of systematic exploration and attempted colonization, and they contained insights about navigation, cross-cultural contact, and resource management that remained relevant to their own age of exploration. When the great age of European exploration began in earnest with Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Magellan, the Viking precedent provided both inspiration and practical knowledge. Norse techniques for long-distance ocean navigation influenced later explorers, and the detailed geographical information preserved in the sagas helped guide subsequent expeditions to the North American coast. But as European colonization of America accelerated in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Viking achievement was sometimes forgotten or minimized. The massive scale of Spanish conquest in Central and South America, the establishment of permanent English and French colonies along the North American coast, and the dramatic demographic and cultural changes that followed made the brief Viking presence seem insignificant by comparison. Yet the indigenous peoples of northeastern America maintained their own memories of the early European visitors. Among the Micmac people of Nova Scotia and the Beothuk of Newfoundland, oral traditions spoke of the people from the Sunrise Sea who had come in great boats with dragon heads, bringing gifts of wonderful metal and taking away shiploads of the forest's treasures. These indigenous memories often preserve details that were not recorded in the Viking sagas. Native American stories told of the Vikings' amazement at seeing corn for the first time, their difficulty in learning to paddle birch-bark canoes, and their respectful behavior at indigenous burial sites. These accounts provided a different perspective on the Viking voyages, showing how the encounters appeared to the Native American participants. As the centuries continued, the story of Vinland began to serve as a symbol of the roads not taken in American history. Scholars and writers wondered what might have happened if Viking colonization had succeeded, if permanent Norse settlements had been established, and if European indigenous relations in America had followed the relatively peaceful pattern established by the early Viking contacts. This speculation was not just idle fantasy. The Viking approach to exploration and settlement had been fundamentally different from later European colonization efforts, where Spanish conquistadors sought gold and glory, English planters sought land and profit, and French voyageurs sought furs and souls to convert. The Vikings had sought simply new places to live and new opportunities to prosper. The Vikings' willingness to trade rather than conquer, to adapt to local conditions rather than imposing their own systems, and to treat indigenous peoples as potential partners rather than obstacles to be overcome, suggested that very different patterns of European-American interaction might have been possible. Of course, we cannot know what would actually have happened if Viking colonization had succeeded. The small scale of Norse settlements, their limited technology, and their dependence on Greenland for support might have made large-scale colonization impossible regardless of indigenous relations. But the example they set remained powerful as a reminder that exploration and settlement need not inevitably lead to conquest and displacement. In the 19th century, as European Americans began to grapple with the moral implications of their continental expansion and the treatment of Native American peoples, the Vinland story gained new relevance. Writers and historians pointed to the Viking example as proof that Europeans and Native Americans could coexist peacefully when approached with proper respect and understanding. This romantic view of Viking indigenous relations was probably somewhat idealized. The sagas themselves record conflicts and misunderstandings alongside peaceful contacts, but the core truth remained valid. The Vikings had demonstrated that cross-cultural contact could be mutually beneficial when conducted with wisdom and restraint. The rediscovery and archaeological confirmation of the Viking sites in the 20th century came at a time when the world was grappling with questions about exploration, colonization, and cultural contact that were remarkably similar to those faced by the medieval Norse. As human beings prepared to explore space and possibly encounter other forms of life, the Vinland sagas offered valuable lessons about approaching the unknown with both courage and humility. The Viking achievement also provided inspiration for modern space exploration. Like the Norse sailors who crossed the Atlantic with primitive technology and uncertain navigation, modern astronauts venture into the unknown using the best tools available to them, knowing that they cannot predict or control every aspect of their journey. The international cooperation required for modern space exploration echoes the cooperative relationships that the Vikings established with indigenous Americans, just as the Norse learned that successful exploration required respect for local knowledge and customs. Modern space agencies have learned that the greatest achievements require collaboration across cultural and national boundaries. As our story nears its end, let us return once more to the essential elements that made the Viking discovery of America such a remarkable human achievement. At its heart, this was a story about the relationship between human beings and the sea, that vast, mysterious element that covers most of our planet and connects all lands and all peoples. The Vikings understood the sea in ways that modern people, with all our technology and scientific knowledge, can barely imagine. For them, the ocean was not just a means of transportation but a living entity with its own moods, its own personality, and its own wisdom. They learned to read the sea's subtle signs, the color of the water, the behavior of seabirds, the shape of clouds on the horizon, and to work with its rhythms, rather than fighting against them. This intimate relationship with the sea enabled them to achieve what seemed impossible, crossing thousands of miles of open ocean in small wooden ships, guided only by their knowledge of stars, currents, and weather patterns. They navigated by instinct as much as by science, trusting their accumulated wisdom about the sea's behavior to guide them safely across waters that had never been charted. The sea also served as a metaphor for the unknown in Viking culture. Just as the ocean stretched beyond the horizon to lands that could only be imagined, so too did life stretch ahead into futures that could not be predicted or controlled. The Vikings who sailed to Vinland were not just crossing physical distances but venturing into the realm of infinite possibility. This philosophical understanding of exploration as a spiritual as well as physical journey gave the Vinland expeditions their deeper meaning. The Vikings were not simply seeking new lands to exploit, but new experiences that would expand their understanding of what it meant to be human. Each voyage was a journey of discovery, not just about the external world but about the inner capabilities of a human spirit. The seasonal rhythm of the Viking expeditions also reflected this deeper understanding. They sailed west in spring, when the world was awakening from winter sleep and everything seemed possible. They explored and established their settlements during the long, bright days of summer when the northern sun barely set and energy seemed endless. They gathered their harvest and prepared for return during autumn, when the colors of the forest blazed like fire and the year's work reached its completion. And they told their stories during winter, when families gathered around warm fires while storms raged outside and the northern lights danced across the star-filled sky. These winter tellings were not just entertainment but a form of spiritual practice, a way of preserving and transmitting the wisdom gained through exploration and adventure. The cyclical nature of this pattern, departure, discovery, return, and retelling created a sustainable rhythm for exploration that could continue generation after generation. Unlike later European colonization efforts that sought to establish permanent dominance over new territories, the Viking pattern allowed for ongoing contact and exchange without requiring the complete transformation of either culture. The children, who grew up hearing these stories, learned more than just exciting tales of adventure. They absorbed a worldview that saw exploration as both a privilege and a responsibility, a chance to expand human knowledge and capability, but also an obligation to treat new discoveries with respect and wisdom. This worldview created a culture that valued both courage and restraint, that celebrated bold achievements while recognizing the importance of learning from failure. The Vikings who sailed to Vinland were heroes, not just because they reached America, but because they did so with honor and returned with wisdom. The women of the Vinland Saga, Red Freitas, and the unnamed wives and mothers who supported the expeditions represent a different but equally important kind of heroism. In a society that often limited women's opportunities for adventure and achievement, these women found ways to participate fully in the greatest adventure of their age. Gudrid in particular became a model for generations of women who refused to accept limitations on their dreams and capabilities. Her journey from young wife to expedition leader to respected elder showed that exploration could transform not just geography but human possibilities. The indigenous peoples who encountered the Vikings also demonstrated remarkable qualities that deserve recognition in any telling of this story. Their willingness to approach strange visitors with curiosity rather than fear, their generosity in sharing knowledge and resources, and their patience with cultural misunderstandings all contributed to the success of the peaceful contacts. The native leaders who met with Leif Erikson and other Viking explorers displayed sophisticated diplomatic skills, carefully managing first contact with an alien culture in ways that protected their own people while gathering valuable information about these unexpected visitors. Their decisions about when to welcome the Vikings and when to resist them showed both wisdom and courage. The technological and cultural exchanges that resulted from Viking indigenous contact had lasting impacts that extended far beyond the direct participants. Iron tools introduced by the Vikings spread through indigenous trade networks across vast distances, reaching communities that never directly met the Norse explorers. Similarly, indigenous knowledge of American geography, plants and animals influenced European understanding of the New World for centuries. These exchanges represented one of the earliest examples of globalization, the process by which distant cultures become connected through trade, communication, and the sharing of ideas. The Viking voyages to Vinland showed that such connections were possible even with medieval technology, given sufficient courage and determination. As our bedtime story reaches its conclusion, we find ourselves back where we began, on the windswept shores of the North Atlantic, where brave souls first dared to imagine what might lie beyond the horizon. But now we understand that the story is not really about the past at all. It is about the eternal human journey toward discovery, understanding, and growth that continues in every generation. The Vikings who discovered America were not so different from the explorers of our own time. Like modern astronauts preparing for missions to Mars, they ventured into unknown environments using the best technology available to them, knowing that they could not predict or control everything they would encounter. Like contemporary scientists, studying climate change or biodiversity, they observed carefully, recorded meticulously, and tried to understand the complex systems they encountered. And like modern people facing the challenges of globalization and cultural diversity, they struggled to find ways for very different peoples to coexist peacefully and beneficially. Their successes and failures in this effort offer lessons that remain relevant today. The geographical scope of the Viking achievement was remarkable. From their original homes in Norway and Denmark, these intrepid explorers established settlements in the Shetland Islands, Iceland and Greenland, then pushed on to discover and explore the coast of North America from Labrador to New England. In the process, they created a network of communication and trade that spanned half the globe. But perhaps even more remarkable was the cultural scope of their achievement. The Vikings successfully adapted to environments as diverse as the volcanoes of Iceland, the glaciers of Greenland, and the forests of Vinland. They learned to work with indigenous peoples whose cultures were completely different from their own. They developed new technologies, new social structures, and new ways of understanding their place in the world. The saga of Vinland also reminds us that not all great achievements result in permanent success. The Viking colonies in Greenland eventually failed. The settlements in Vinland were abandoned, and for centuries the entire story was preserved only in oral tradition and ancient texts that few people could read. Yet the achievement itself was not diminished by its temporary nature. The Vikings had proven that the Atlantic could be crossed, that America could be reached, and that different cultures could find ways to communicate and cooperate. These accomplishments became part of human knowledge and capability, even when the specific settlements that created them disappeared. This pattern of achievement, loss, and rediscovery is common in human history. Great advances are often forgotten or lost, only to be rediscovered later by people who may not even know they are following in ancient footsteps. The Viking discovery of America was lost to European consciousness for centuries. But the knowledge and capabilities that made it possible were preserved in the collective human heritage and eventually enabled even greater achievements. The archaeological rediscovery of the Viking sites in the 20th century came at a perfect time to remind the modern world of these important lessons. As humanity stood on the verge of space exploration and global communication, the Vinland story offered both inspiration and guidance for how to approach new frontiers with wisdom and responsibility today. As we face challenges that would have been unimaginable to the Vikings, climate change, global communication, space exploration, and contact with potentially extraterrestrial intelligence, the lessons of Vinland remain remarkably relevant. The Vikings' combination of bold exploration with cultural sensitivity, their willingness to learn from other peoples, and their recognition that discovery brings both opportunities and responsibilities, all offer guidance for navigating up their own unknown territories. The spirit of exploration that drove Eric the Red to sail beyond Iceland's shores, that inspired Leif to venture into uncharted waters, and that motivated Gudrid to participate fully in the greatest adventure of her age, continues to live in every human being who looks at the unknown and sees not just danger but possibility. Whether we are exploring the depths of the ocean, the vastness of space, or the complexity of our own minds and societies, we are all inheritors of the Viking legacy. We are all potential explorers, capable of sailing beyond our own horizons in search of new worlds and new ways of being human. On their final night in Vinland, before loading their ships and sailing back to Greenland, Leif and his men gathered one last time around their campfire on the beach. The northern lights were particularly bright that evening, painting the sky in shimmering curtains of green and gold that reflected off the gentle waves of the bay. As they sat in comfortable silence, each man lost in his own thoughts about what they had discovered and what it meant, Turka spoke words that would be remembered and repeated for generations. "Look above us," the wise German said, pointing to the brilliant display of aurora dancing across the heavens. "These same lights shine over our homes in Greenland and Iceland. They connect all lands under the same sky. We have sailed far from home, but we have never truly left it, because the same stars watch over us wherever we go." Leif nodded thoughtfully. "And look around us," he added, gesturing to the forest that surrounded their camp. "This land is different from ours in every way. The trees, the animals, the climate, even the very soil under our feet. Yet human beings live here and thrive here, just as we do in our own lands. Perhaps this tells us something important about what it means to be human." The men sat in contemplative silence, absorbing the profound truth of what they had experienced. They had discovered not just a new continent, but a new understanding of the world's vastness and diversity. They had learned that the earth was far larger than they had ever imagined, that it contained wonders beyond their wildest dreams, and that human beings had found ways to create successful civilizations in environments they had never conceived possible. But they had also learned something even more important. that, despite all the differences in appearance, language and custom, the fundamental human qualities of curiosity, creativity, and kindness were universal. The indigenous peoples they had met were as intelligent, as capable, and as worthy of respect as any people they had known in their homeland. Young Thorvald, who would later lead his own tragic expedition to Vinland, spoke the thoughts that were in all their minds. When we return home and tell our stories, people will think we are describing a land of magic and fantasy. How can we make them understand that this is real, that such places actually exist in our world? Leif smiled and picked up a piece of driftwood from the fire, its surface carved with intricate patterns by years of wave action. We carry the proof with us, he said, holding up the wood so it caught the firelight. Not just the wine and the timber and the furs, but the knowledge we have gained. We return as different men than we were when we left, and that difference will show in everything we do. And indeed, this transformation was perhaps the most important result of the Vinland voyages. The Vikings who returned from America brought back more than trade goods and geographical knowledge. They brought expanded consciousness, a broader understanding of human possibility, and a deeper appreciation for the complexity and wonder of the world. This transformation affected not just the individual explorers but their entire society. The stories they told inspired others to see beyond the limitations of their immediate environment. The knowledge they shared encouraged innovation and creativity. The example they set of peaceful contacts with foreign peoples influenced how Vikings approached other cultures they encountered in their travels. The ripple effects of the Vinland discoveries spread throughout the Viking world and beyond. Merchants who traded with the Vikings carried stories of the Western lands to markets. In England, Ireland, and continental Europe, priests and scholars who visited Viking settlements included accounts of Vinland in their chronicles and letters. Gradually, knowledge of the American discoveries became part of the broader European understanding of world geography. And so, dear listeners, as the soft music of our bedtime story draws to a close and the gentle sound of waves carries you toward peaceful sleep, remember that the story of Vinland is ultimately your story too. For within each of us lives the same spirit of exploration that drove Eric the Red to sail beyond the known world, the same curiosity that led Leif to discover new lands, and the same courage that enabled Gudrid to venture into the unknown. The Vikings who discovered America were not superhuman heroes from a distant age, but ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things. They were farmers and traders, parents and children, people with fears and doubts who nevertheless found the courage to sail beyond the horizon in search of something better. Their ships were made of wood and iron, powered by wind and human muscle. Their navigation tools were simple: the stars, the sun, the flight patterns of birds, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of seafarers. They had no radios to call for help, no weather satellites to warn them of storms, no GPS to tell them exactly where they were. Yet with these simple tools and their own determination, they achieved something that seems almost magical. They sailed across the vast Atlantic Ocean and discovered a new continent. They established peaceful contact with peoples completely different from themselves. They created settlements in the American wilderness and proved that human beings could adapt and thrive anywhere they chose to make their home. The legacy of their achievement extends far beyond the historical facts of who reached America first or when European contact with the New World began. The true legacy of Vinland lies in its demonstration that the human capacity for exploration, adaptation, and growth knows no limits. Every time someone chooses to venture beyond their comfort zone, to explore new ideas or new places, to reach out to people different from themselves, they are continuing the journey that began when Eric the Red first sailed west from Iceland. Every act of courage, every gesture of friendship across cultural boundaries, every decision to see opportunity where others see only danger, carries forward the spirit of the Vinland voyages. The children of today who dream of exploring the ocean depths, traveling to distant planets, or simply discovering what lies beyond the next hill, are the direct spiritual descendants of Leif the Lucky and his brave companions. The scientists who study climate change, the diplomats who work for peace between nations, the teachers who help young people expand their understanding of the world, all are engaged in the same fundamental human activity as the Vikings who discovered America. The story of Vinland reminds us that exploration is not just about reaching new places but about becoming new kinds of people. The Vikings who returned from America were transformed by their experience, carrying within themselves a broader understanding of what it meant to be human. They had seen that the world was larger and more wonderful than they had ever imagined, and that knowledge changed everything about how they lived their lives. As you drift off to sleep tonight, dear listener, carry with you the knowledge that you too are an explorer. Every day offers opportunities to discover something new about yourself, about other people, about the world around you. Every choice to be kind rather than cruel, to be curious rather than fearful, to be open rather than closed, continues the great human journey of exploration and discovery. The northern lights that shone over Vinland 1,000 years ago still dance across the polar skies. The stars that guided Leif across the Atlantic still shine in the same patterns, waiting to guide new generations of explorers toward their own discoveries. The sea that carried the Vikings to America still connects all the world's shores, reminding us that no place is truly isolated and no people are truly alone. The grapes still grow wild in the forests of what was once called Vinland, though now we call it by other names. The salmon still run in the rivers where Thorvald found such abundance. The great trees of Markland still reach toward the sky. Though many forests have fallen and grown again in the centuries since Viking axes first tasted their wood. And somewhere in the forests of eastern Canada, weathered stones still mark the graves of Thorvald and other Vikings who gave their lives for the dream of discovery. These simple monuments remind us that exploration sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice, but that the knowledge and inspiration gained from brave endeavors live on long after the explorers themselves have sailed to distant shores. The indigenous peoples whose ancestors met the Vikings still live in the lands where these first encounters took place. They are the keepers of oral traditions that preserve different perspectives on the same events we have been exploring tonight. Their stories remind us that every act of exploration affects not just the explorers but all the people whose lives are touched by discovery and change. In our modern world, we face challenges that would have amazed and perhaps frightened the Vikings. Climate change threatens to alter the planet they knew and loved. Technology connects us with distant peoples in ways they could never have imagined. Space exploration carries human beings beyond the Earth itself, to destinations that even the most visionary Viking could not have conceived. Yet the fundamental human qualities that enabled the Vinland voyages, courage, curiosity, adaptability, and respect for others, remain as essential today as they were 1,000 years ago. The same spirit that carried Eric the Red beyond the edge of the known world lives on in every person who chooses to venture beyond their own limitations in search of growth and understanding. And now, dear traveler through time and space, as our story comes to its gentle end, let the rhythm of the waves and the whisper of the wind carry you into peaceful sleep. In your dreams tonight, you may find yourself sailing aboard a Viking longship at Dragonprow, cutting through the dark waters of the North Atlantic as you journey toward lands unknown. You may dream of standing beside Leif the Lucky as he takes his first steps onto American soil, or walking with Gudrid through the forests of Vinland as she gathers the wild grapes that would give the land its name. You may find yourself trading with indigenous peoples beside a crystal-clear river, learning new words and new ways of seeing the world. In your dreams, you may hear the songs of the Skalds echoing across the centuries, preserving the stories of brave explorers who dared to sail beyond the horizon. You may see the northern lights dancing over settlements where Vikings and Native Americans learned to live as neighbors, sharing the abundance of a continent that was home to all. But whether your dreams carry you to the fjords of Greenland, the forests of Vinland, or the endless expanse of the Western Sea, remember that you are not just a passive observer of these ancient adventures. You are a participant in the ongoing human story of exploration and discovery, carrying within yourself the same potential for courage, wisdom, and wonder that made the Viking achievement possible. The sea that carried the Vikings to America still calls to the human spirit, inviting us to venture beyond our familiar shores in search of new understanding and new possibilities. The stars that guided their navigation still shine above us, offering direction to anyone brave enough to set course for unknown destinations. And the spirit of exploration that drove ordinary Vikings to achieve extraordinary things still lives within each of us, waiting to be awakened by the right combination of opportunity, courage, and vision. Whether our personal Vinland lies across an ocean, in a new career, in a creative project, or simply in a deeper understanding of ourselves and others, the journey remains the same, a voyage into the unknown, guided by hope and sustained by the knowledge that the greatest discoveries await those who dare to sail beyond the familiar. So sleep well tonight, brave explorer. Rest peacefully in the knowledge that tomorrow brings new opportunities for discovery, new chances to venture beyond your own horizon, new possibilities for adventure and growth. The Viking spirit lives on in everyone who chooses courage over fear, curiosity over complacency, and hope over resignation. May your dreams be filled with the songs of whales and the whisper of wind in great sails. May you wake refreshed and ready for your own voyages of discovery, whatever form they may take. And may you always remember that the same stars that guided Leif the Lucky across the Western Sea still shine above you, ready to light your path toward whatever wonders await beyond your own personal horizon. The saga of Vinland is ended, but the story of human exploration continues forever. Sleep well, and dream of new worlds waiting to be discovered.